Chris Field is joining us, who's an interdisciplinary scientist in quantum physics and many other fields, and you've heard about the others. And the way I see it, that all the discussion last night and this morning is all leading to this panel, to the discussion. I'm participate a little bit, but I'm going to be mostly facilitator, really, of discussion. Make sure that the scientists speak to you in the languages you understand, and they can speak to each other in the way scientists speak to each other. Not the way spiritual teachers speak to each other. Right. But also in a language that everybody else understands. I only have 2 questions myself, but I think that will bring up many things, and everybody can ask each other questions, and you know each other, although you have different points of view. First question I have is a simple one, which is when you talk about the hard problem of science, which is consciousness. I would like each one here to give their working definition of consciousness. But how do they define consciousness in a way that makes them do their research, do their thinking? So maybe each one can spend a few minutes just giving us what is their definition of consciousness. We want to see whether we're talking about the same thing. So we could begin, Chris.
Okay. Am I on? I think so. So I try to think of consciousness in what I think is the simplest possible way as phenomenal awareness of something or other. So examples would include raw visual experience, raw auditory experience, a kind of experience that I think is extremely important is the raw experience of touch or of taste. And I actually think that touch and taste are kinds of consciousness or kinds of awareness that bear a lot more examination than they typically get, because we tend to focus on things like vision. And beyond that, we as human beings tend to experience a lot of other kinds of stuff. So we have these experiences that we experience as memories. So there's a component of our experience that says, this is a memory, that distinguishes it from this is a sensory experience that's happening right now. So there's something that we experience that one could think of maybe as a marker or just a tag that says, okay, this experience has a particular kind of function, it's a memory. So we have this experience for this kind of tag. We have a particular kind of experience that we experience as an experience of self. And that's a very complicated bit of semantics to say that this experience is an experience of me. So that, in a sense, is a kind of tag, too. It's much more complex, and I think much more difficult to understand or even talk about than simply a raw touch or a simple taste. So in thinking about consciousness, I'm actually most attracted to thinking about the consciousness of what we tend to think of as extremely simple systems like microbes that live very much in a world of touch and taste, and for example don't apparently perceive things like three-dimensional space at all, don't have this sense that we have of bounded objects that are distant from them. And they may provide us with a way of understanding consciousness in a way that's much more fundamental or basic than the way that we try to understand it when we think about our own consciousness, which involves a lot of these complexities that go beyond the very simple kinds of sensory awareness of light or sound or touch, taste, electrical shocks, and so forth. So for me, when I talk about consciousness, I try to talk about the most basic possible phenomenon of awareness of something.
Well, William James, in his very famous Principles of Psychology, 2 volumes based on his Harvard lectures, talked about the subject matter of his course on psychology, and he said what he was talking about was our thoughts, ideas, and feelings. And so I use that as my understanding, my basic understanding of what consciousness is. It's our thoughts, ideas, and feelings. And but I want to, and he also ties it into memory in a certain way. And because our thoughts, every one of our conscious thoughts has a huge memory component in it. All of the lots of things that we've learned in the past have all kind of fed into this present conscious experience. And without the memories of the past, it somehow wouldn't really be an experience. And in that regard, I was thinking about Hameroff's and Penrose's model, and last night I was thinking about it, and the following thing occurred to me, which is quite relevant to this. So according to Penrose and Hameroff, when a certain set of properties of the mass distribution occur, then according to Penrose's formula, a conscious experience occurs. A collapse happens, and a conscious experience occurs. So that leads me to say, well, suppose we have we're brewing up a cup of stuff out there in the universe. We're doing some experiments, and we put a bunch of stuff together in sparks and stuff, whatever is required, such that according to Penrose's formula, a collapse is going to occur and a conscious experience is going to happen. That's the formula. And well, in this case, there's no history. I mean, we've put a bunch of elements together, and we've done whatever is needed to have a mass distribution. And so according to the formula, a collapse occurs, and that means a conscious experience occurs. But if that conscious experience has no history, I mean, we've just put it together and made it up now, there's no history. And so my question was, well, is it really a conscious experience? Penrose says, yes, a conscious experience. Bing is the word that we heard yesterday a couple of times. A bing happens, but this bing has no history to it. And so that seems to me that something is left out of that being a true experience. I mean, it doesn't have a historical background, and would it really have thoughts, ideas, and feelings associated with it? And by the way, finally, this aspect of feelings is, in some sense, the most important, because William James, in his way of talking about things, kind of regards, in the end, all of these more detailed thoughts and ideas are really ultimately articulated feelings. They're somehow feelings about things that are a little more articulated and have more structure, but he uses feelings ultimately as the ultimate characteristic of a conscious experience.
So, I feel like, speaking of feelings, I feel like I use conscious experience, or conscious awareness, or conscious experience in terms of an individual conscious awareness, so my conscious experience, as my anything that's going on in my experience. So it can be sensations, so smell, taste, touch, vision, memories, emotions, predictions about future events, regrets about past events, all of that. So anything that I have privy to. And to me, the reason I keep bringing up my consciousness in the definition, you were saying, you know, you were saying that the self is sort of self-consciousness is even at a different level and more complex and difficult to describe. I think that's what you were saying. And I agree. And at the same time, when you're talking about individual consciousness, you have to talk about the individual, right? Because that's what distinguishes what we're talking about as scientists about consciousness from what mystics talk about, and some scientists also talk about, which is this sort of higher consciousness or world mind or awareness or universal consciousness, or what I call the non-conscious. So the stuff that is sort of pervasive, but of which we are, most of us, not normally aware during our waking hours. So the consciousness that I'm talking about goes away when you're in deep sleep. Individual consciousness goes away when you're in deep sleep every night. It goes away, and then it hopefully comes back when you wake up, and it goes away when Stuart puts you into an anesthetized state, and then it hopefully comes back because he's a good anesthesiologist, and
we only charge to wake him up.
It's great. So, but the self part, to me, is really important and interesting, and I don't think you have the distinction between the two without understanding self. And so what you said about touch and taste is very interesting, because I remember nursing my son when he was an infant and realizing that he was still almost certainly in the state of not knowing that he had a self, and that he must know that when he's nursing, he has a taste of this sweetness in his mouth, and when he's not nursing, he doesn't. And when he's nursing, he has this sort of soft, bulbous body around him. And when he's not nursing, he doesn't. And that distinction based on sensation is just, to me, the very beginning of the very first duality, which is me, not me. And to me, that's what, from what consciousness may arise, or individual consciousness may arise from the realization of the individual. It's obviously a chicken and egg problem. But anyway, so I feel like that piece has to be discussed.
Can I just add a little bit to this? There is this famous definition of consciousness as that which is present when you're awake, and which disappears when you go to sleep, a dreamless sleep, and reappears when you wake up in the morning. But that's not a very good definition of consciousness, because there could be some sort of just material activity that's different in those three cases, having nothing to do with consciousness. So it's a very poor definition of consciousness. Those particular qualities could have nothing to do with, there could be something quite different that has nothing to do with consciousness, just some particular
For sure, like
sort
this monitor disappears when I go to sleep, and then when I wake up, it's maybe going to be back again.
That's right.
Right, it's a corollary. It's not a definition. So the definition is what it is that you're experiencing, what it is that of which you have private access.
Right.
But one thing I want to say about the sleep thing, in the Indian Vedic traditions, the sleep is considered a state of consciousness. That consciousness has 4 states: waking, dreaming, sleep, and turiya, which is awake, enlightenment. So sleep is considered a state of consciousness in the Indian traditions.
But the Vedic tradition is way more focused on the definition of consciousness as this sort of universal, unified, less private experience. And so I'm not surprised that that would be one of the states, because it would have to pervade everything.
I think you're right. Hopefully we'll get to that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Let me address Henry's comments. And yes, you accurately described our view that these collapses by the uncertainty principle, which are due to separations in underlying space-time geometry, but are unstable and then will self-collapse after time t, given by the magnitude of the separation, are occurring everywhere. They're occurring in the chair, in the floor, in the air around us, in parts of our body that are not conscious, all the time, and have been always occurring that way. And to be consistent, we say yes, they have to have a moment of experience, of awareness. But they're very random. They become quickly entangled with the random, also quantum environment, and so they don't have any meaning. And as you say, they don't have any history, they don't have any memory, and their only causal action is random. They choose one or the other state, and then that's it. They're forgotten, and then something else happens. Now, in living systems, starting from the primordial soup, as I talked about last night, these collapses can occur in systems, pi resonance systems, for example, where they're shielded from a random environment, and they get together with other pi resonance systems, and some of these collapses will then have some pleasurable quality to them, and they will associate with other pi resonance groups in specific geometries, and the pleasure acts as a feedback fitness function to arrange the geometry to optimize pleasure. And in fact, as I said last night, that is how I believe life originated in the primordial soup, and how life has evolved and continues to evolve to optimize pleasure, proto-pleasure initially, and then becoming more sophisticated, more orchestrated, more pleasurable. And that could be, hedonistic pleasure, but it could also be altruism. It feels better to give than to receive. Spiritual pleasure, resonating with the universe, harmony, and so forth. And so I offer that. We offer that as an alternative to the standard view in evolution, where life evolves to further the genes and the survival of the genes, the selfish gene concept, because genes without any feelings, there's no motivation to do anything. And if you say that they're programmed to do that, then you have to say they're programmed by what? By God. So you may as well just start from God in the first place.
Excuse me, Stuart, but how do you define consciousness? What is consciousness for you?
Well, we've heard a bunch of words: awareness, subjective experience, phenomenal subjectivity, a first-person point of view. I like Chris's view that it can be very simple, and I think it can be even simpler than that. But whatever you do, it's going to be a word, and we all know what it is, assuming everybody here is consciousness. And as I've said, it kind of, to paraphrase the Supreme Court Justice, it's kind of like pornography. You know it when you see it. So we know it when we have it, and we know that we're conscious, but I can't prove it in anybody else. You can't prove it in me. I could be a zombie cleverly programmed to talk about consciousness, and we can't assure that our patients are unconscious, which is why we use these sophisticated monitors and so forth, which don't really help. It's basically clinical judgment, which works pretty well, fortunately. So it's hard to define, but you know what it is.
Thank you.
So you, all of your explanations, you gave as one possibility at some point that consciousness is tied to living beings. And as you presented it, it was...
Well, no. So consciousness with memory and with meaning and with causal behavior is tied to living systems. But it can happen, as I said, in the table all around us. But if you're asking for a godlike consciousness or something with wisdom, I think that would come from the Platonic values that are embedded in the structure of the universe, which influence each consciousness when you get sufficiently orchestrated in your collapses.
So you do have consciousness occurring outside of outside of...
Well, we call it proto-consciousness, but it's awareness, it's subjective, but it's random and lacks meaning, lacks memory, lacks functional causal behavior, but it's happening everywhere. It's universal.
So your idea of consciousness then seems to depend a lot on matter, and in particular, all of your detailed studies, of course, have to do with the brain, in fact, and microtubules and things like this. So, to what extent is this kind of a matter-based concept? It seems more materialistic than some of the views of some of the other of us.
Well, I do believe in a material world. I don't think consciousness emerges from material complexity. I think I would say a neutral monist like Bertrand Russell, where I would say there's one entity. I'll call it space-time geometry, and I know Don's going to differ with this, but you start with space-time geometry, you have separations in space-time geometry which don't necessarily involve mass, although curvature is somewhat equivalent to mass, and it reaches a threshold for collapse, and you have conscious moments that can occur at a level below atoms or quarks or whatever.
Well, but if you keep if you include curvature and stuff like this, basically the underlying reality seems to be something like a material reality, and consciousness comes out of that. So
no, just the opposite, Henry. What I'm saying is that when you start with space-time geometry and superposition, you have a collapse, and as Russell said, you start with one thing and you get matter and mind, and the mind in this case would be memory, and the consciousness is in the collapse process. So it gives rise to matter in a particular configuration. So it's somewhat consistent with your view, except as I understand it, you're saying consciousness comes in from somewhere, and I think Don would agree with you and causes collapse, whereas we're saying that no, it's a self-collapse when you start with the universe separating and having a superposition, and it reaches this threshold and chooses one or the other with a moment of subjective experience.
Wait, so for you, space-time is fundamental.
Yes.
And for you, mind is fundamental. And for neither of you is matter fundamental. That's what you're saying?
Yes. And now we're going to hear a different view from him.
I have a question to sort of clarify for the audience. When you talk, Stuart, about space-time geometry and collapse, the orchestrated
yeah, your collapse.
collapse.
Say,
What do you mean by space-time geometry? So you could tell everybody here.
this
what
value
does it
that you
mean?
talk about. Just this value. What was the name of it? You gave space-time value.
Platonic.
Platonic values.
Yeah.
And whereas, of course, in our life, it's our personal values that seem to be entering into our choices. I mean, to the extent that we are the underpinning of conscious experiences, the important thing about it is that it's our personal experience.
Yeah, but where do they come from? In other words, what I'm saying is and this came from Penrose's The Emperor's New Mind, the non-computable factor where algorithmic processing doesn't account for consciousness. For example, understanding is something non-computable. It requires something coming from outside the system to influence the choices in the collapse. So the implication is that if we're mindful and thoughtful and make a conscious decision, our choices are going to be influenced by Platonic values that are actually intrinsically built into the structure of the universe. You could say that our choices resonate with the structure of the universe, and we make an ethical and aesthetic choice based on those Platonic values. And over time, over the course of our lifetimes, our personal values mirror those, and so we tend to make aesthetic and ethical choices based on the Platonic values that were there right from the start, and even before we were born, influencing choices.
So our personal values could then sometimes be bad values in some sense.
Well, Hitler happened, right. And so you'd have to say that either he was wired backwards, or maybe there's evil Platonic values embedded in the universe, or some other rational explanation. But clearly, evil exists, and not everybody follows divine guidance or the way of the Tao or whatever, and people get it backwards. But or there could be evil Platonic values. I don't know. I can't answer.
Yeah, so we have 2 points of view here. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to help the audience for you, Stuart, to explain.
Yeah, we're starting to sound like a bunch of scientists talking to each other.
It has to do with the geometry of space-time.
Yeah.
What will people take from that?
Yeah.
What's that?
What do you mean? Tell people, what do you mean that consciousness has to do with the structure of space-time?
Well, what is space-time geometry? And Donna was alluding to this, and we have a disagreement. But we know that if you go smaller than the size of atoms or quarks or whatever, And there's a lot of empty space. Atoms are mostly empty, and the space between atoms. But as you go down and down in scale, smaller and smaller and smaller, eventually you get to the Planck scale where there's structure, there's period, there's regularity, there's coarseness, there's information. And there's a lot of suggestion that space-time is somewhat fractal or holographic, so that information, say at the Planck scale, where there is coarseness and information, repeats like 1 over f, 1 over frequency, like every several orders of magnitude. And this has been found in gravity waves, for example. And this can repeat all the way up to getting to biological levels, so that it's possible that we are influenced by these platonic values that have been embedded in the universe. And this also relates to the cosmological dimensionless constants that define the universe, the ratio of the mass of the electron to the proton and this and that, which happen to be perfectly tuned for life and consciousness to exist. And this is called the anthropic principle. And there's two approaches to the anthropic principle. The weak anthropic principle says we're in the perfect universe. We won the cosmic lottery for the only universe that can support life and consciousness, because there's an infinite number of universes, multiple worlds, and only in this one are there conscious humans, and we're the only ones around to ask the question. Now, I think that's kind of a cop-out and a kind of a silly argument, and you don't need all those multiple worlds. I think it's more likely that consciousness is intrinsic, and one of those is included in those constants that help to evolve the universe over eons, maybe even previous Big Bangs, according to Penrose, and that the universe has evolved to optimize life and consciousness. And consciousness is driving not only the evolution of biology and life, as Don would agree, but also the evolution of the universe itself.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe Don will turn to
Yes.
find consciousness.
So I agree with a lot that's been said. For example, I agree that a key aspect of consciousness are conscious experiences, like the taste of chocolate, the smell of a rose. Also, our ideas, our knowledge of mathematics, our knowledge, our scientific beliefs, our personal beliefs, our thoughts and feelings. So all of those are part of it. I think another part, and of course memory and so forth. Agency as well. So this is something that Henry brought up in his talk, that we are, based on our experiences, we can actually make decisions and take actions. I think that's also part of the whole package of consciousness, so that I talk about conscious agents, not just consciousness by itself. But
Wait, Don, can I clarify something?
Yes.
When you say agency, do you mean the experience of agency, or do you mean actual truthful agency?
Both. So the experience of actually being able to influence other consciousnesses and actually being able to influence them. So both the experience and the fact of agency.
Isn't collapse agency, you choose one or the other? Or you being the collapse itself?
Oh, yeah, I'll get there. Yeah. So the idea then is that one key idea I think that's critical for us moving forward is that also the assumption, and it's a falsifiable assumption, that consciousness has a structure, that we can actually write down a mathematical description of it. Not to say that consciousness is mathematics, it's not. But the way science works is we take a domain and we try to write down a desiccation of that domain in mathematics. And that desiccation has a lot of the formal combinatorial structure of that domain and allows us to make new predictions that we couldn't have made otherwise. I think we can do the same thing with consciousness, and that we can get a science of consciousness because consciousness is amenable to rigorous mathematical formulation. As long as we're careful that we recognize that consciousness is not the mathematics is not the consciousness. The mathematics is just a description, but nevertheless a powerful description that can guide experiments. I also think that consciousness is not in space and time at all, but that space and time are, for some consciousnesses, a way that they represent and it's a format for their experiences. So space and time are not at all fundamental. For Homo sapiens, it's a way that we happen to use to get through the day and survive and reproduce. So in that regard, I would, of course, then be on a different page with Stuart. So that's an important, interesting issue that we'll find out as it goes forward. Many physicists are now saying that space-time is doomed. I mentioned Nima Arkhani Hamed. There are many others who are saying this. I'm suggesting from evolutionary grounds that they're right, that space-time and physical objects are just a species-specific kind of representational system that some consciousnesses use, but it's not required. So those would be the main points that I would say. All of us would like to have science and spirituality meet at some point. And to have that happen, we're going to have a science of consciousness. And we cannot have a science of consciousness until we have a mathematical model of it that's falsifiable, that makes new predictions, that can be tested and shown to be right or wrong. So that we can, and by the way, I presented a model last year, and I can tell you that model was wrong. We've discovered in the last year that there are details in the mathematics that are wrong. We've now fixed it. We have a different mathematical model of conscious agents than we had last year. That's the goal. So I can now tell you I was wrong last year, and I'm probably wrong this year. But the goal is to be precise so that I or others can find out exactly why we're precisely wrong and move on.
Well, yeah, I think it depends on what your field is. So you trust math, and so that's what you want consciousness to be defined as. And I also trust math, and I also trust empiricism. So I want to do experiments that tell me how I'm wrong about what I think about consciousness. And
well, he's right that math can lead to experiments, but I would say that the relevant equation for consciousness is the uncertainty principle, E equals h over t. So when the superposition E sub g, the gravitational self-energy, reaches the threshold of h bar over t, at time t, the self-collapse happens. That's a testable prediction that's very consistent with what we know about the brain, which is, so far at least, the only definite location of consciousness. Although we all agree it's elsewhere. But.
So I think we're going to get to the second question I have before, because first I'm trying to clarify what we mean by consciousness, whether we agree. And from what I see, a common thing that everybody sort of agrees on about consciousness, although slight differences, is that the definition of consciousness has to do with what consciousness does. It feels, thinks, perceives, has experiences. But all of it has to do with the function of consciousness. I'm saying this because from spiritual teachings, consciousness is not looked at as what these things, what consciousness does, are seen as a content of consciousness. Consciousness is what makes these possible. Consciousness underlies all feelings and perceptions and thoughts and all of that, but it is more fundamental. I'm saying this not to say we're wrong. I said that's what the scientists are dealing with, what happens, because science usually deals with behavior, with how things happen, not with the fundamental ontological realities of things, which is fine with me. And so I just wanted to make that and see if there's anybody disagrees with that here, that we're all discussing what consciousness does, what happens in consciousness.
But that's like the basic problem I see at SAND in terms of talking about consciousness, because there's the scientists who generally, they know about this other definition of consciousness as this fundamental universal thing, but there's a distinction, an important distinction between that and sort of our individual, everyday waking consciousness, right? And to call it the same thing just invites confusion, right? And so I agree with you that the spiritual teachings are saying this about consciousness, but they're talking about something else. So I think that we're both right, but we're talking about different things.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Oh, okay.
That we're talking about something else. Consciousness, we're talking about experience and the capacity to have experience.
Right.
The capacity of experiencing and perceiving and all of that. And the spiritual people are not really talking about that. They're talking about what is the ground and the medium where all these things happen.
Yeah, yeah. Right. They're talking about like one mind.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to sort of get us all on the same page and something.
We're not going to be on the same page.
Yeah. Well, I have the second question, which is the most important one. Each one of you, yes, Chris.
Yeah, may I first just make a remark about your remark, which is that science does a thing which we typically don't do in non-scientific everyday life, which is to set particular concepts very explicitly on the table as undefined.
Yeah.
So in physics, the very core concept of physics is energy, which Stuart mentioned in the uncertainty principle, for example. That's the very basic concept in physics. And energy is an undefined term. We can say what its units are, but the concept of energy is left undefined. And it has to be left undefined because it's one of the things, or at least if you formulate physics in a particular way, it has to be left undefined because everything else is defined in terms of it.
Yeah.
And so in physics, we talk about what energy does, but we never talk about what energy is. And I think you're seeing exactly the same phenomenon here.
Yes.
And it's a phenomenon across science. In every science, you'll have these terms.
Because science wants to explore things that are measurable, and these are behavioral things.
Yeah, exactly.
So my second question, which I think is relevant so each one of you can really contribute. Each one of you is in the field that touches on consciousness or contributes to an understanding of consciousness or mind. So I would like each one of you to tell the audience, how is your thinking or understanding or your theory or research contributes and addresses the hard problem of science, that is of consciousness. How does it contribute to our understanding of that hard problem of consciousness? Because each one of you has different theory, different understanding. I want to see how each one here, theory or understanding or research, contributes to understanding this hard problem of consciousness. Okay. Then we can have a discussion between the different point of views. So who want to start?
Well, I'll start. I'd say that the hard problem refers to the nature of experience and qualia. So raw feelings, emotions. And by the way, Henry was saying about the importance of feelings, and I would say experiences from every collapse is essentially a feeling, and feelings drove evolution. But so I would start that the hard problem can be addressed by self-collapse producing conscious experience. And then, and these are very simple experiences, feelings, emotions, kind of like, and then they get orchestrated and organized into the full, rich, conscious experience that we have, kind of like a painter with a palette who has a bunch of dabs, he or she has a bunch of dabs of paint and takes a dab of this, a dab of that, and you get the Mona Lisa. So that's what our brains do by accessing these raw qualia that are present everywhere due to collapses occurring here, there, and everywhere, and organizes them or orchestrates them into full, rich, conscious experience. So the difference is very much like the difference between an orchestra warming up, where you hear all these random tones, noises, sound, and they're all doing their individual thing, and then all of a sudden they break into Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or a reggae song, whatever. It becomes music. Now, in that case, in the case of an orchestra, you have a conductor, but in the brain or in consciousness, there's no conductor. It's more like jazz. It's more like self-organizing. And it's also more like music in that there are different scales, different octaves, if you will. And Anirban Bandipati has shown these triplets in resonances in the brain, in the microtubules. I almost went a whole session without saying microtubules, but there they are. Where you have from terahertz to gigahertz, megahertz, kilohertz, and then hertz, EEG, and then slower the default modes. And if you go faster the other way, you go into the pure structure of the universe, where you can have consciousness, I believe, even without biology. So I would say it's these resonant vibrations that give rise to the full, rich conscious experience. And to sum it up, I would say that consciousness is a process on the edge between the quantum and classical worlds. And in fact, in the Kabbalah, somebody pointed me to a quote that said, consciousness dances on the edge between two worlds. And I think the actual edge between the quantum and classical worlds is collapse. Now, these guys, Henry and Don, would say that it's a collapse caused by external consciousness. I would say it's a self-collapse that generates consciousness or channels consciousness, if you will, that's already present in the universe due to ubiquitous collapses.
So I have a question for you, Stuart. I actually am familiar with the theory used in Penrose, which I appreciate. It's one of, I think, most promising theory, just like Henry has a nice theory. My question, you talk about how the collapse, because the collapse accounts for the qualia and all of that. Have you and Penrose worked out the mathematics of how each particular experience explained by a particular formula? Or are you making a generalization from a theory about what is experience, which is a collapse of a wave function? Or are you really have worked out the details of how each qualia happens?
I think you're being a little bit tough on me, but
well, we're trying to see where are we.
Let me just say that I think
Yeah.
we've got a more advanced theory than anybody else, because
Might be, but I just
because
want to
we
know
include-
how far you got. I don't know.
okay, wait. So we include the physics, biology, philosophy,
Yeah.
metaphysics, general relativity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Psychology, cognitive science, philosophy. Now, if you're asking about the content of consciousness, why I'm having an experience of looking out at the audience and of you, it's because all these primitives that make it up are being orchestrated by the microtubules in my brain to self-collapse, say, at least 40 times a second, maybe as fast as 10 million times a second, and to give this experience. So the content would have to do with the processing that goes into it. It's essentially quantum computation. But as far as the pure qualia, if I go back to what I was saying last night about life originating in the primordial soup due to these amphipathic molecules that are very much like dopamine. So we know that dopamine is the pleasure molecule, and it's thought to be a neurotransmitter in certain parts of the brain, and when it's involved, there's pleasure, there's reward, that leads to addiction and many other things, but all pleasure seems to be mediated through that, whereas serotonin has more of a mood component. So it could be that the shape of the pi resonance clouds that collapse create the particular qualia, and the way that these pi resonance groups are arranged geometrically within a molecule give rise to the specific qualia.
So it could be, but so far you haven't proposed experiments to verify that. You say it could be that.
No, well, we've proposed experiments. For example, quantum resonances in microtubules, which would be inhibited by anesthetics and enhanced or accelerated by psychoactive drugs. So you have a system of microtubules, you're measuring quantum resonances at these various frequencies, you give it anesthetic gas and it goes away, you give a different anesthetic that's twice as potent and you need only half as much, then you give DMT or LSD and it goes really high frequency and gets more quantum. I think that would be the next step that's doable. Now, would that tell you what experience those microtubules in this dish were having? No, not yet, we can't talk to them. But eventually there could be something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting, in terms of the theory that you have, you and Penrose,
So,
is that it is, Penrose seems to look that the physical world pretty much is mathematical in order. He believes in the Platonic world of mathematics, and that underlies physical reality. But then when it comes to consciousness and mind, it comes out of the physical, instead of the conscious mind coming also out of the Platonic world.
Well, it's related to the Platonic world in that it's resonating with the Platonic world, which is influencing the choices. So instead of random probabilistic collapse as occurs in Copenhagen, for example, or in decoherence, by the Born rule. The Born rule is violated by Platonic influence due to these non-computable factors. So if I make a choice, I really like that painting, or this really tastes good, you could say that it's because my brain, my microtubules are resonating with Platonic values embedded in space-time, so it makes it feel good and taste good.
In Platonic values, you are including things like love and pleasure. You're not just including just mathematics. in Platonic world. You're including things. You talk about Platonic values.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
including things like pleasure and love
Yeah.
and pain, not just mathematics.
Right. Well, Roger started with mathematics, and then when we wrote our hard problem paper in 1996, we included qualia and ethical and aesthetic values. So the non-computable Platonic values could influence you towards something beautiful, something ethical. Love is certainly a feeling, and feelings in general. I think feelings are primary. I think a lot of us agree with that, and drive evolution. I think life evolved to feel good in all of its various manifestations, whether it's love, whether it's tasting good, whether it's reproduction, whatever. That's what drives behavior. That's what drives everybody's behavior. I think people are here because they want to seek understanding, which feels good, and to meet people and have a good time. So we're still being guided by seeking various forms of pleasure.
Thanks for explaining. I understand better. Let's see anybody else want to go.
Well,
Henry.
So that Penrose view is the view that is being put forth by Stuart here. And of course, the question always being circled around is actually the role of consciousness in that mechanism that he's talking about, and the words Platonic values come in. The mainstream, or the much more mainstream view, is basically orthodox quantum theory. Quantum theory, as it evolved, started with a pragmatic view, namely that, very much in tune with what Hoffman said, that the point of view originally established, or that was originally adopted by quantum theory, was that it was a practical set of rules that would allow you to make useful predictions, and of course, by useful predictions, that would certainly include survival. And so the original idea of quantum mechanics was that it was a practical, pragmatic theory, and this idea of pragmatism fits pretty well into survival that Hoffman was talking about. So that was the original pragmatic Copenhagen interpretation of quantum theory. But the question then arises, can we form a more detailed picture of what's going on, mathematically described picture of what's going on behind these practical rules? And the answer is yes, particularly in the hands of von Neumann. He developed, and there's a huge thick book all filled with the details and about how you can understand a reality behind these rules, and how it is that your conscious experiences play a very specified role in this mathematically described theory. And the practical role that your consciousness plays in this theory is to make choices about what your next, or your choices actually are about what you're going to probe, what you're going to inquire about. Mm-hmm. So there is a place in the theory, the choices made by the conscious observers, as to what choice is going to be, what you're going to ask, what questions you're going to ask about nature. So this is part of the theory. It's fit in a very straightforward way, and the outshot of it is that you do have a well-defined mechanical idea of the evolution according to certain laws that are spelled out, and all the mathematics is worked out. And the role of the observer is to come in, basically just to ask questions. And the other key idea is you have what's called the state, the quantum state of the system. It's both, ultimately, it's the state of the entire universe. And this state, quantum state, it's mathematically described, behaves in certain ways. And these ways are influenced by these choices, which are sitting in a certain place in the mathematical formalism. more or less exactly in the place that we feel they appear, namely in our choices of what we're going to ask about. And so there is a well-defined orthodox theory about this, which gives you a very clear picture of what's going on and tells you exactly how your thoughts are entering into the scheme of things, and it's called orthodox quantum theory. And so I find it a very totally well-defined and very understandable theory of what's going on that seems to be, in my mind, much better defined than what Stuart is talking about. But so that's how my understanding.
Henry, I see that in your theory, consciousness and minds are involved in the theory. But does the theory help us to understand consciousness? How does it help us understand? What does it contribute to understanding consciousness?
That's right. These feelings feed right into the structure of the mathematical theory in a particular way, and in a particular way that we feel they do. As a matter of fact, when we ask a question, you know, I've obtained a certain knowledge about the physical world according to a process that's understood, and we now have some knowledge. And of course, if the knowledge is that something is going to come down and fall on my hand, I act on the basis of this knowledge, and I pull my hand back. So there's nothing mysterious about it in this point of view.
Is it dualist?
Mathematics is there. What?
You're dualist. Consciousness coming from the outside.
Let me add, that's the very key question. This model is a dualistic model. You have mind and you have matter, and you explain exactly how they connect to each other according to mathematical rules, and it ties into your conscious experience in a particular way that is the way we feel it does. And so at that point, we have a dualistic theory. Now, the core of my talk this morning earlier was that so we have a dualistic model, but if you look at how the material part behaves, the material part is this mathematical described structure of reality. The material part is such that it's represented by this quantum state. And what happens is the quantum state, if I get some knowledge about this quantum state, and then I ask a question. Now I should say that the form of this, the meaning of this state, is that it gives predictions, statistical predictions about what would happen if you do certain, if you ask certain questions. It gives the statistical predictions if you ask some well-defined question, what the probability is that you're going to get a certain result back. So it's well-defined, and so at that point, as I say, we have this matter, but the matter is represented by a quantum mechanical state. And the point is, this quantum mechanical state, once I get new knowledge about it, it jumps to a collapsed state that represents the part of the original state that's compatible with the answer that nature has given to the question. So the material part has this idea-like structure. You get new information and it changes to a new form that's compatible with the information that you just received. So, but that's how an idea behaves. And so ultimately, although we started with two things, we found that the matter-like part really behaved like an idea, and so we're left purely with an idea-like, fundamentally idea-like universe.
So, come on, Chris, you want to say about, we have
Okay,
here
well,
2 points of view. I want to hear, what's your view and what do you think of these 2 point of views?
Well, I guess I'll make the bold statement that if we understand the hard problem as why is there any awareness at all, and if the question is have we come any closer to explaining why there's any awareness at all, I would say the answer is no. I don't think we have a theory at all of why there is awareness per se anywhere in the universe. I think what all of the scientific work from many different directions is contributing to this discussion is, as you mentioned before, a much better understanding of what awareness does, why awareness is useful, under what conditions will a given system be aware of a particular phenomenon. This is the question you asked Stuart, of course. Does the mathematics allow us to predict this? And I would say no one has a formula now that's going to predict exactly what I see in the next 5 seconds, or even to say, what am I seeing right now, given what my brain is doing or something like that. But that's a question that it's at least imaginable how to answer. But that theory would not tell us why there's awareness at all. And I would also say that what I believe the science is enabling is a push toward the realization that awareness, and I'll use that term in the sense that I define the word consciousness, so something extremely simple. I think there is a definite pressure building in the scientific community toward the idea that awareness has to be a fundamental assumption, that we really do have to drop this business of awareness per se being generated by a particular organization of neurons, which is very much the standard view in neuroscience, or a particular organization of something else, any kinds of material objects, as Henry was saying. We should have dropped this whole business of material objects in the early 20th century. It became very clear in the early 20th century that there aren't any material objects as traditionally conceived of by Newton. And virtually everyone still talks about material objects, but there can't be any if any of our science is correct. The way I like to put this is that we all believe that there are objective boundaries around things. So, we believe that there's an objective boundary around me and an objective boundary around the lectern, and so on and so forth. But if you actually look at the formalism of quantum theory or even of classical theory, the formalism itself requires that those boundaries cannot be objective. The formalism requires that basic physical processes don't care at all about the boundary around my body or the boundary around that lectern or the boundary around anything else. So to the extent that our notion of an object, a particle, or whatever, includes an objectively real boundary, then that notion simply contradicts our very best science. So it has to go. And I can't predict how long it will take for these kinds of ideas to pervade most of working science. After all, when Julia does an experiment, she has to assume as a practical matter that there's a difference between her experimental subject and the computer that she's programmed with a random number generator. The experiment can't even be described if you don't make that distinction. And we can't talk about measurement without talking about a distinction between the observer and the system being observed. But in a very real sense, our science tells us that none of those distinctions even though they're very useful to us, are part of the reality out there that Don depicts with his, strings of numbers rolling down a screen, just as a way of saying that reality is nothing at all like what we see. And what quantum theory has been trying to tell us for 100 years now is that physical reality is nothing whatsoever like what Newton thought it was. And I think the sooner we get that through our collective heads, the better off we'll be. That doesn't solve the hard problem. In fact, it doesn't say anything about why there's awareness at all. But at least it changes our perspective on what our awareness is doing. Mm-hmm. Our awareness is doing something very constructive. And I think that change in our idea of what our awareness is doing is valuable.
Yeah.
Even though it's not a solution.
So it seems there's an agreement from everybody here that consciousness does affect things, right?
I'd like to disagree. I'd like to be a person here who disagrees.
Yeah, but I was thinking, I have one question. Stuart gives a theory that shows where consciousness comes from in terms of perturbation and microtubules, as I understand it. Henry, you talk about mind as consciousness as affecting experience in general. Where does mind come from in your understanding?
Where does mind come from?
Yeah, because Stuart has an idea where mind or consciousness come from.
Yeah.
What's your theory say?
Well, this hard problem is sometimes asked as why does consciousness there? And but I don't think that is really the meaning. I mean, we know that consciousness is there. I think it's got to be taken as the fundamental fact. Consciousness exists. We do have it, and the question is, how does it fit in to the rest of our understanding of nature? How does something like this kind of non-material,
you're not trying to really explain consciousness
of atoms and molecules?
I see. So you're not really trying to explain consciousness.
I'm sorry.
You're not trying to explain consciousness. You're just taking it as a fact.
My hearing is not so good. What did he say?
You're not trying to explain it. You're just taking it as a fact.
Yeah, consciousness has got to be explained as a fact, accepted as a fact, and the meaning of why is this question the hard problem? Why does consciousness exist?
Yeah.
I think should be taken as why do we need it to understand the rest of things, not why it exists. I mean, we know it exists, and we should take it as foundational. But the question is, why is it needed? Why doesn't the material description do it all, leaving out consciousness, which is the materialist view? And my take on Penrose's theory is that it's too close to materialist view. It seems to be taking various things that are described in material terms, maybe structure of space-time, as foundational, rather than understanding where that comes from. And I think what Chris has been saying is that, basically, Penrose has what seems to be a materialist foundation, because he seems to be saying that there's something underneath consciousness, and then something happens, and consciousness appears, rather than the whole thing is embedded in consciousness in the first place.
Yeah, thanks. Henry, Julia, now you want to say something?
Oh yeah. So I don't know that I agree that. Consciousness, our individual consciousness does anything. And I just want to make a few comments about this process of asking the question, because it's a great question. And so David Chalmers, who is a philosopher, first asked, was famous for naming the hard problem, and he asked a bunch of philosophers and scientists, so why is there any experience at all? Why is there any awareness? And because scientists do not answer why questions very well, except for finding the proximal causes, like why did I lift my finger? Well, there's neurons that go to my muscles in my finger and contract my muscles, etc. That's a proximal cause. But in terms of a philosophical or sort of more distal cause, scientists that's not in our wheelhouse. It's like a philosophical or a theological question. So Chalmers asking scientists that why question is like me asking Chalmers, so, what do you think about long-term potentiation in the nervous system? Do you think that's responsible for learning? I mean, so it's the wrong group of people, it's just not the thing that we do. And so I don't think science is ever going to give an answer that's going to be appropriate for a philosopher or a theologian to the hard problem. But what scientists do is, the neuroscientists do anyway, is they turn it into, if they're materialists, they turn it into how does the brain create consciousness, right? And if they're post-materialist, they might say, how is consciousness, which is fundamental, how is that related to the brain? And when you start talking about the hard problem as a relationship between the brain and awareness, you're basically talking about a correlation. You're looking for a causative correlation. In other words, we see a correlation. I've known people who have neural defects, and I've known them before the defect and then after the defect, and there's a change in their behavior. And enough observations like this, and it's pretty clear to all of us that there's a relationship to whatever this thing is that we're calling a brain. There's a relationship between that and whatever this thing is that we're calling consciousness. I think we can all agree that there's some kind of a relationship. And then when you start looking for causality, which I think is one step towards addressing the hard problem, then you have to understand time. Because causality is first I do this and then I do that. And the reason causality is first I do this and then that happens or then I do that is because our conscious awareness orders things in this kind of linear fashion. So we have the idea of causality, A causes B if A comes before B, and if without A, B doesn't happen, and with A, B does happen, right? So there's our causal principle. But so the data that I look at again and again keep me awake at night because A comes after B, according to clock time, and yet A is causing a change in B. So that's not the kind of causality that we're used to. So when you have a violation like that, and you realize that your conscious awareness is potentially being tricked, or something's being tricked, maybe it's non-conscious is false, but it's producing these changes in the body. Something's being tricked about the nature of events and the order of them, and I think it's our conscious awareness. Then you start to say, I'll just say what I think. I start to feel like, is the hard problem an interesting question? Because a more interesting question to me is, there's all this information out there that we're not getting in our conscious awareness. And what's the story with that? And what's the relationship between that and our conscious experience? The hard problem is just a problem of our conscious experience. How does our conscious experience of the brain relate to our conscious experience of subjective states?
So when you talk about unconscious processes,
non-conscious processes, anything of which we're not conscious.
Are you referring to operations happening in the brain?
I'm talking about, so this is a fundamental...
Or unconscious, the way Freud talks about unconscious.
No, so Freud talks about unconscious as, there's the preconscious, there's the unconscious, there's the subconscious. These are all components of our psychology, our psyche, right?
Yeah.
I'm making a fundamental distinction that is, to me, the most basic distinction that can be made, which is between those things of which we are conscious and everything else. And I'm calling everything else non-conscious processes simply because we're not conscious of them. That doesn't mean, by the way, that they themselves are not conscious.
It does not mean they're not, but they're non-conscious, but they're happening.
Sure, they're processes, so they're happening.
Where are they happening?
Where?
Yeah.
Well, so
the brain?
For
are
me,
you talking about the brain or just the universe?
Everywhere.
Everywhere.
So for
you're not
me,
saying,
you're part of my non-conscious because
I'm
not
not
conscious.
talking brain processes only then.
The entire body, including the brain, is non-conscious.
Yeah.
Because I have no private access to what's going on in my brain right now. I can't tell you, when I said that, my left frontal cortex was I mean, I could assume that there was some firing going on there, but you know, I don't have internal subjective experience of it. So it's non-conscious to me, just the same way that you're non-conscious to me, which does not mean that it itself is not conscious or that you're not conscious. It's that you're part of my non-conscious. So there's this division between everything that I have private access to and everything else. It's very similar to what Henry was saying about there's the observer and there's nature. So the observer is the piece that has private access to a chunk of information, and then there's everything else. And what we find is that everything else, including my body, has information that the observer is not privy to.
So we have a lot of knowledge going on that we're not conscious of at the present time.
So to me, that's a more fundamental question, because this other question is about two things that are in our conscious awareness. So it's on one side of this duality.
Yeah, I was just curious, because most neuroscientists think consciousness has to do with neurons.
Yeah, I'm different from
And I was wondering whether you're adhering to that or not.
Oh, does consciousness have to do with neurons? Maybe. I feel like the whole field gets taken over by this idea that it's almost egoic. It's like, we're so special, we have these experiences, we better explain them, they're so amazing, aren't we great? What's really going on that we're not consciously aware of is so much more aware than our conscious awareness. That it feels like we're trying to explain the wrong thing. It's like, oh, we're going to play with these little toys, but there's this like giant mountain over here. It's just like we have evidence of it. We have evidence of it through quantum mechanics. We have evidence of it through the kind of experiments we do.
You're a kind of neuroscientist, Julia.
Yep.
So, and as we know, Stuart uses neuroscience to explain consciousness.
Yeah.
Can I address her backward time effects?
Let me ask her first. What do you think of his view about consciousness and neuroscience?
Stuart's?
Yeah. Does
Maybe,
it make any sense to you?
I mean, I think his view is very compelling. And I think that it's not the most interesting question to me. What I'm trying to say is, it's like, what's the correlation between this monitor and that chair? I don't know. Maybe there's a correlation. But what I want to get at is the most fundamental distinction we have as human beings. And that's what interests me, is understanding the relationship between my private experience and every single thing else that's going on. And the realization that every single thing else that's going on has way more information and way more awareness than I do. And so to be so fascinated with our own awareness and trying to explain that seems just like, That's how I feel.
Our consciousness. So you're saying our consciousness is really an island in a sea of knowledge that we're not aware of.
Right. It's like we're looking at the tip of the iceberg, and how does this part of the iceberg relate to that part of the iceberg? Well, let's try to understand that there's all this other ice under the water and what the relationship is there. You know.
I think Stuart wanted to say.
Well, I want to address Julia's backward time effects of the unconscious, and I think that's very important. And quantum information goes backward in time, and there's a number of lines of evidence that when you have a collapse, that there's the classical information that goes forward and quantum information goes backward. And this is consistent with Libet, Bierman, Radin, Daryl Bem, also from quantum physics, Yakir Aharonov's dual vector theory, and Penrose's explanation of entanglement, where you make a measurement here and quantum information goes back to when the two particles were together and then forward. So quantum information in the brain, I think, is necessary for us acting in real time and giving a modicum of free will, because if we're talking back and forth and you say something, if you measure the activity in my brain that's corresponds to what you say, I've already responded to you. And that leads neuroscientists to say the consciousness is epiphenomenal, happens after the fact, and I responded non-consciously. Now that avoids the question of, well, where's the neural activity for the non-conscious activity, which they never come up with. So I think backward time effects, apparently due to quantum collapses in the brain, give you this backward time effects. Otherwise, we would be living in the past. And it would certainly be an evolutionary advantage to act in real time, or even ahead of time, if that were possible, in a predator-prey relationship.
Well, only if other animals are also acting in real time. If they're also acting in the past with the same delay you have, then everyone's acting at the same time anyway.
Well, but you got to keep up with the Joneses. If this creature has backward time and I don't, he's going to eat me.
Right, I guess what I'm saying is if it's a central feature of your conscious experience that you're delayed by 8 seconds in time, and so anyone else with conscious experience is delayed by 8 seconds in time, you might as well just be at the current time.
Well, but that would apply to other organisms. But what about a rock falling down a mountain? If I'm 8 seconds behind, I'm not going to be able to get out of the way. I mean,
Yeah, you will because you're 8 seconds behind. So your perceptual system is matching that. So in other words,
No, the rock doesn't follow that, though.
everything follows that because it's all in your perceptual system.
Well, okay, so you want to get rid of reality altogether.
No.
I like reality.
No, I don't think you can. No, I mean, I want to point out that conscious experience is all we got. It's all we got.
No.
No, I'm not saying that I'm an idealist. I'm not saying it's all there is. I'm saying it's all the information we have.
So a rock falling down a mountain, or Don's example of jumping in front of the train, that's not, I mean, if he's 8 seconds behind, okay, he thinks he can get across before the train comes, but if he's 8 seconds behind,
He's
he's
8
like a bug on a
seconds
windshield.
behind throughout his life. Let's imagine. I don't think people
But
are
the
8 seconds
but the
behind.
rock
But let's
isn't. The train isn't.
Just listen to me for a second. If you're growing up in the world where you're always 8 seconds behind, your system has some external physical reality that follows apparently some linear order. Your system has learned to treat that 8 seconds as if it is now. And therefore, you have learned when someone comes and slaps you on the hand because you stole a cookie, you've learned to pull your hand back because you basically, you put on those glasses that can change your angle of vision, and then within moments, your angle is changed. You adapt to it very quickly, even though reality is over there. You adapt perfectly by grabbing something from over here.
So
Just
if
the
I'm
nature of the
playing
perception.
basketball one-on-one with somebody and he's in real time and I'm 8 seconds behind, who's going to win?
Well, clearly that's not the situation we're talking about. Clearly
Well,
the situation
why
that
not?
we're talking, well, because what I said was if every animal is 8 seconds behind. So in that situation, one animal is not 8 seconds behind. This is not an
But the
not
rock
an
coming
essential
down the
point, but-
mountain or the tree falling is not 8 seconds behind. So it's definitely good for survival to be in real time or even ahead of time. So I'm supporting your backward time effect, and I think
No,
it's
you totally are, and I appreciate it, and I think your model is very interesting, and I think that I think that none of it is, to me, as fascinating as trying to understand this other greater duality. That's what I'm saying.
Thank you both. And obviously, the conversation can continue. I want to see what Donald says about his contribution.
Yes. So, a lot of stuff here.
Yeah.
I would say that cognitive neuroscientists have discovered that they can be very successful if they're physicalists, assuming that neurons exist and have neural activity and so forth. They're very successful at explaining intelligence, language, memory, learning, things that are functionally defined.
Actually, they're not, but go ahead. They can't explain memory, but please.
Well,
Sorry to
there are neural networks that I've built that work fine at modeling memory. They do it quite well. So, in fact, I build systems that have memories that learn that.
But in the
can be-
brain, the synaptic proteins are transient. They only last hours to days, and memories last lifetimes.
But he's talking about cognitive models.
Yeah.
Let Donald first do his thing.
There's no in-principle problem. Of course, there are details. We'd like to get as close to the physiology as possible, but there are no in-principle problems with starting with a physicalist world interpretation, artificial neural networks, and doing all sorts of things. We can build cars that drive themselves now better than humans. So it's not a problem. We have a problem, though, when we try to start with the same assumptions and get just my experience of the taste of chocolate. All of a sudden, we're stopped. We can do intelligence, we can do learning, memory, problem solving. We cannot do something that even a rat can do, which is taste chocolate and have a conscious experience. That's the hard problem. It's hard because the physicalist assumptions run up against a hard wall there. So that was the source of the hard problem. There's also another hard problem that we've been talking about here, which is why is there any conscious experience at all? But that's a separate issue. The hard problem is understood in cognitive neuroscience is this one. Why do our models that work so well for all the rest of the mind fail on something so simple as the taste of chocolate? So the way I've been trying to approach this is to say, look, no scientific theory explains everything. Every scientific theory says, grant me these givens, and then I will derive these things. So grant me that space and time and matter exist, for example, and then they're trying to say, I will show you how consciousness emerges. So I have these unconscious ingredients that you have to grant me. You know, I don't know where they came from. They came in the Big Bang. Where did that come from? I don't know. So that's granted. But those are the unconscious ingredients, and you have to cook up consciousness from the unconscious ingredients. And the hard problem is, you know, we can't do it. We've tried and tried and tried to take these unconscious ingredients and cook up consciousness, and we can't do it. So my approach is to say, okay, well, everybody assumes something, and everybody here thinks consciousness exists, but maybe just the false assumption is we have to grant the unconscious as the given, the physical stuff. So I'm going to turn it around. Let's say I'm going to try to solve the hard problem in the other direction. Let's start with consciousness. Now we have to be scientists here, so that's why I want a mathematical model of consciousness. But let's start with consciousness. That's my given. Now, the hard problem, the problem I have to solve is the other direction. If I start with consciousness, I have to then show that I can get back all of quantum mechanics and all of physical theory without any hand wave. I've got to get it all, and preferably I get it all plus new predictions that they haven't come up with, so that I actually have a theory that takes us the next step. So the idea then is, if you start with unconscious ingredients and try to get consciousness, it's a mystery. There's no intelligent thing that's been said about how to do that. But if you start with consciousness and try to then get back physics, it's no longer a mystery. It's actually, it's not trivial, but it's not a mystery. We're making serious progress on this. So that's the direction I'm going. I'm trying to start with a mathematical model of consciousness and get all of quantum physics coming out of it. But all of us, my own attitude is that we really, to make progress and to be taken seriously, we're all on the same page here. We all think consciousness is important. We all want science to take it seriously. How are we going to make that happen? We can only make it happen if we have a mathematical model of consciousness that makes new predictions that are empirical. So I agree we need empirical testing, no doubt about it. But we have to make new predictions that they can't make. New predictions that they can't make, and that turn out to be true in the experiments. So we have to have falsifiable, rigorous mathematical models of consciousness. So that's the direction I'm trying to solve the hard problem.
So you believe consciousness is algorithmic?
No, not at all.
So mathematical. Yeah.
So again, there's the difference between the map and the territory. All scientists can do is write down mathematical models and make predictions. That's all. So in some sense, science can do very little, right? We write down mathematical models, we make predictions, we run experiments, and we test them. If I give you a mathematical model of the weather, and I build a simulation of it, I take you into the computer room and show it to you, you don't need an umbrella, right? You're not going to get wet. There's no, even though it's a mathematical simulation of the weather that will predict tsunamis and everything, you don't have to worry about getting wet. It doesn't create the weather. So our models are models, they're not the reality. And this model of consciousness will not be consciousness. It will simply be the abstract mathematical structure that we find best models consciousness and that can make new predictions. But that's if we want to play the science game, we have to do it that way. And so I'll put it out very, very clearly in terms of Stuart's model and so forth. We would need, for his model, what we want is precise description of all the different ways that collapse can happen. The objective collapse by quantum, by gravity. All the different ways that could happen, all the different conscious experiences, the smell of garlic, the taste of chocolate, and then we need laws, precise mathematical laws that say, if this is the form of the collapse, then this is the precise predicted conscious experience that you will have. And we need to know why. So we would have to have a systematic set of laws that ties the particular physics of the collapse to a particular conscious experience. Until we have that, we don't have it. And in the case of the time issue, we need a mathematically precise theory that says exactly why it's 8 seconds. Why isn't it 8,000 years? Why isn't it 8/10 of a second? We need a mathematical model that predicts exactly the time lag or the time prediction of the unconscious processing. Until then, why should we be taken seriously? We don't have a model that we are falsifiable. If our model says, for example, a scientist would say, you have a model that predicted 15-second lag, but there's only 8, so your model is wrong. Now we're playing science, right?
Yeah.
Where did 8 seconds come?
So the 8 seconds thing was just something I just made up. That's definitely not a hypothesis that I have. And then we started talking about basketball. But
whatever.
I guess I disagree. I guess I disagree. I think that if you if you see data, and you see data that in an experiment that's methodologically reasonable, and you see the results again and again, just because you don't have a model, mathematical model of what's going on, doesn't mean that doesn't exist and there isn't something to explain. Like before Newton wrote down his description of gravity, did not mean that there wasn't something to take seriously. I mean, even by your own model, you take icons seriously, right? But you don't take them literally. Well, so it's the same thing here, right? You take the empirical data seriously, and then you work toward the reason you want to make a model of consciousness is because you have an empirical experience of consciousness. So you're taking it seriously and you're creating your model because there's something to explain out there.
Right.
So I would just like to correct that one.
Right. Yeah, I would agree that the data are important. The data are the data, and if they are not compatible with the current theories, that's important for the current theories. But what we need is for us to move consciousness forward as being taken seriously as a scientific foundation for a new kind of science, then we need to go beyond just the experimental data and say, here's our precise predictive our theories, our precise mathematical theories. And we actually predicted, it was going to be 0.8 of a second, and it turned out to be 1.3, and so we're actually wrong.
And what's wrong?
And so we're wrong.
Sure, of course.
So we want to put ourselves out there with falsifiable theories where we say, if you get this result, I'm wrong. Until we tell the outside world how we could be wrong, they're not going to be interested.
But I feel like all of us have theories that can be proved wrong. And so I don't, and some are more mathematical than others, like Stuart and Rogers. Right. So I totally agree with you.
Right. Yeah, I think that's where we should be headed. I think we're on the same page there.
Now I have a question. You're talking about precise mathematical theory describes consciousness. If you have a mathematical theory for consciousness, does that mean that because you're describing it with a mathematical theory, you can build a computer according to such mathematical theory?
Good question. Not necessarily, because most aspects of mathematics are not computable. So, for example, if you just look at the set of integers and look at all the functions from the integers to the integers, there's an uncountable collection of functions, but it's provable from Turing that the computable functions are only countable. And that means that almost every function is not computable. So, and there's no reason our scientific theories should be restrained to just have access to the computable functions. So it doesn't mean that we're saying it's necessarily computable by a Turing, universal Turing machine kind of thing. So it doesn't require that. I would say one other thing, by the way, in response to your earlier question about consciousness being an action versus, from the spiritual point of view, being just a more grounding kind of thing in which the actions can take place. When we actually look at the mathematical model of conscious agents that comes out of the mathematics that we come up with to actually look at the dynamics of consciousness, consciousness doing stuff, requires a ground, a mathematical ground in which that can take place. And so it looks like when you actually do it this way that the duality between the action versus that the scientific theory of consciousness might have versus the spiritual notion of a grounding goes away, because both are required to get the mathematics to work right.
Yeah. Chris, say something.
I just wanted to make another side remark that it hits on what Don was saying, and I think also what Julia was saying, that if you think about a mathematical theory, and we say, okay, we have a mathematical theory of consciousness, what's that for? It's some set of equations, and they're going to have some input parameters that are required, and it may be a very simple theory. You might be able to program it up on your PC and stick in some inputs and get some outputs. But I think the point Don made about the weather is extremely important. That having a theory of any
Oh, they're on.
Whether your theory is implemented on a computer or on a pencil and paper or just by thinking in your head, the theory being a theory about consciousness doesn't say anything about its implementation. I mean, any theory can be implemented in any way, and they're all equivalent. And all the theory is for, any of our theories are for. And Henry, you made this point. They're practical devices. And the only purpose of having a theory is to predict what I'm going to see next.
So it doesn't help us to know consciousness?
Scientific theories, as far as I'm concerned, have no ontological implications whatsoever. And our problem, or a problem in science and in culture, is to leap from a scientific description which is extremely useful, gives us the right answer, tells us where the meter on the dial is going to stop. That's what theories are for.
So
gives us ontology.
So sounds what you're saying then is science is never going to solve the hard problem.
Yes, that's at least what I was saying.
That's what you're saying. The science is not going to solve the hard problem.
And I actually agree
purview
with
of science.
Julia that the usual formulation of the hard problem is not very interesting. It's like, why is there energy? Well, there just is. You assume it. You can't do anything if you don't assume it.
Yeah. Okay, Henry, you want to say?
Well, yes, and so I think we agreed. Consciousness we know exists, and the question is, but we do have to make use of it because these predictions that we get appear in our consciousness. I mean, that's what we want to explain, given some initial experiences appearing in our consciousness. How do we make predictions about what will happen if we do X? And consciousness is absolutely fundamental to the whole structure, and it's what the whole thing is absolutely built upon. There's no question about that. And so the question is there that, how does that play into the materialist view that neuroscientists today are unanimously adhering to, a classical mechanical idea where consciousness basically is not very important, that everything is produced, the conscious experiences are produced by some sort of material thing that's going on in the world, which is regarded as more elementary and primary. And
But here's what's beautiful. I mean, here's what strikes me as beautiful.
Yeah.
What strikes me as beautiful is that, Chris and Henry were just saying that the point of science is to predict what happens next. And that's what happens next based on our conscious experience of events, because that's what happens next is defined by our perceptual systems, right? What's amazing is that if we're motivated sort of as a culture and as a people to try to figure out what happens next, it drives us towards answering the question two ways. One is through the realm of conscious experience and mathematical models and prediction of future events, and another way, which is through the back end of non-conscious, because the non-conscious processes actually know what happens next, right? And so what's beautiful is that these two systems are working together to get to the same point, which is to the realization of what happens next. What's funny is that we decide that we want to go the hard way, which is through our conscious experience, which insists on this linear order of events so that there is a next to predict, of which we are unaware. Instead of maybe there's another way through the back end of identifying with the non-conscious, or what I'm calling the non-conscious, and which many people who are in mystical states might call the transcendent mind or whatever. And so it's just, anyway, it seems like all roads lead to the same place, and that's pretty cool.
Okay, Henry.
Yeah, I just want to make one, I think, important remark. You said, so we want to make predictions about the reading of the dial, where the pointer is on the dials. So you let that be the objective, to predict where the prediction, where the counter, where the pointer will appear on the dial. But that's not where it stops. It doesn't stop at that point. In fact, if you look at quantum mechanics, You make predictions about the dial, and at a certain point, it's smeared out all over the place. And that's the key point of quantum mechanics. You've got to ask, the next question is about what your experience is going to be. And that's a different issue. One is a physical question of where the dial is going to be, but quantum mechanics basically usually doesn't answer that question. It gives you a smear. And then the question is, how do you get from the smear to an experience that appears? And so there's a whole process in quantum mechanics about how you get from this thing, the position of the pointer, or how you not get from the position of the pointer. You get what the theory is predicting about the physical structure. It's a smear of possibilities. So the whole key point is, how do you get from this smear to a conscious experience, which is always of the form the pointer is either here or here or here, and quantum mechanics gives you a statistical prediction about what the result of the experience will be.
I have a third question that just arose from our discussion. You know, from the way I understand it, science in general wants to find out facts, explain facts, wants to find the truth about our experience and our observation. And it is all mostly oriented from the beginning toward betterment of human experience, the betterment of humankind, so that we benefit from it, from our science. You know, you get scientific grant if you're not going to do something that's going to come out useful for human beings. So science both is an attempt to find the truth of reality, but also the truth of reality that will be useful for human being, to make human being happier or deal with life, or as Stuart said, that evolution is more about feeling better. So I was thinking, but at the same time we're saying here that science does not really deal with, doesn't answer the question of what is consciousness. What is the nature of consciousness? Only can explore what consciousness does, what happens in consciousness, what kind of prediction we make. Now, when we go to spiritual teaching, the thrust of all spiritual teaching is that if we're going to be happy, if we really going to be liberated, we need to know consciousness. Nothing else. Everything else is secondary in the happiness of a human being. That, in fact, all spiritual teachings talk about enlightenment, liberation, which means final release of suffering is by knowing consciousness. But now you're telling me that science isn't going to help us with that. Here we have science and non-duality, trying to bring science and non-duality together. And you're all telling me, as if you're saying, science cannot be brought with non-duality.
Yeah, but you're talking about a different consciousness again. When you say that the ultimate liberation is knowing consciousness, you're talking about this one mind thing, which is what I call the non-conscious, right? And what people here are referring to the individual conscious experience.
For me, the one mind thing is a conscious state. For spiritual people, the one mind thing is a conscious state.
I understand, but that's different than what we're talking about. So
I know.
But what I'm saying is,
it's different from what everybody's talking about. But if everybody, I'm getting it. Yeah. But everybody is not talking about what the spiritual masters are talking about.
We're not solving that problem right now.
But they're saying, if you're going to be happy, you better listen to them.
Right.
And the whole endeavor here of science and non-duality is how to bring these two together.
Yeah,
are you telling me we can't bring them together?
No, I think we can, but we're not asking the right questions. When we're asking the question about hard problem of consciousness, we're asking about two things in the state of what you would call in the spiritual world the state of suffering, which is in the state of illusion. We're talking about the brain and our individual experience. Those are not the questions that are going to address basic existential suffering. The basic existential suffering questions are, how do I bridge the gap between this fundamental duality of my individual consciousness and everything of which I'm not conscious, which is the transcendent mind? That's the fundamental question that we need to be looking at, I think, if we want to have any relationship to ending suffering.
I mean, my understanding is Zaya and Maurizio are hoping that science will move toward a direction toward making the experience of consciousness possible, so that more human beings are really happy and liberated.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, is science really moving that way, or science going off in a different direction?
I think that it can. I think that that, in fact, would be one of the proofs of the completeness of a scientific theory. If it, in fact, can start to give us insights into these deeper spiritual issues. So I would actually take that. The nice thing about mathematical theories is that they're always smarter than the person who wrote them down. They always take you places that you never would have gone on your own. So Einstein wrote down the equations of general relativity. He didn't believe in black holes. He didn't know about black holes. He was surprised that his own theory entailed the existence of black holes. So as we move forward, I think that a mathematical theory of consciousness is going to not only be useful in the scientific realm, but it may lead us to new insights that will actually help spiritual people have a richer understanding of their spiritual experience. I fully expect that a successful science of science will enrich spirituality of science, of consciousness in a way that the spiritual people never imagined possible, and the scientists never imagined possible. It's going to go both ways.
Let me, I would say also that trying to understand the hard problem, it's not a totally philosophical, wild goose chase. Even if we never get there, we peel more layers off the onion and we get closer and closer. And for example, let's say, in my work, it's led to the discovery, for example, that the microtubules have megahertz resonances. The microtubules are known to fall apart in Alzheimer's disease. If we put megahertz into the brain in the form of transcranial ultrasound, it looks like we may be able to help Alzheimer's disease and also brain injury, depression, and so forth. So there's an example where pursuit of a somewhat esoteric, abstract, well, it's not, I don't think it's abstract, but hard problem could lead to benefit, not in the spiritual sense, but certainly in the medical sense, to help people with Alzheimer's, for example. But I want to make one comment. Henry has accused us of being materialists, and materialists accuse us of being mystics, so we must be doing something right.
Probably.
Now, I have a question for you, Stuart. I was about your theory, and the Orch RD theory. It sounds like the assumption is that consciousness arises through the quantum perturbation in the microtubules. But it seems to be the way the theory is stated. The theory can be taken easily, that all that you have proven is that those quantum fluctuation makes consciousness possible. It doesn't say. The theory hasn't proven that it produces consciousnness. That the quantum perturbation produces.
Well, as you know, many people would say...
You could take it either way, that it produces it or it makes it possible.
Well, it's a little bit of both. And many people hear, and I've heard this many times for many years, that the brain is just a receiver like a TV set. Consciousness is out there, and it just allows us to tune to a certain channel or station to get our conscious experience. And to some extent, that is true. Because, as I said before, the raw qualia, due to objective reduction, is happening everywhere in the universe, willy-nilly, and it's the structure of the brain, specifically the microtubule, specifically in the quantum channels of the pi resonance inside the microtubule walls, where the quantum effects are allowed to occur, which is where anesthesia acts to erase consciousness. that allows the qualia that are present in the universe for the artist to grab a dab of this, a dab of that to make a masterpiece. The microtubules allow the qualia that are present due to collapses occurring anyway to be organized or orchestrated. And again, I go back to the music analogy to take raw tones or noises or sounds into music. So I think consciousness is more like music than computation. I think the brain is more like an instrument or an orchestra, a quantum orchestra, than it is a computer. And so I think that's a step forward, and it's a step towards the kind of spiritual traditions that many people here subscribe to.
So am I understanding that you and Penrose theory allows the possibility that the neurons and their microtubules and whatever happens in them allows the idea that consciousness is an emergent property instead of epiphenomena of the brain?
I wouldn't use emergent, but definitely not epiphenomenal. Emergent implies complexity.
Sounds you and Penrose talk it as an epiphenomena.
No,
but sounds to me what you have proven is that it is related to consciousness.
What is related to consciousness?
That those perturbations are somehow associated with consciousness. That the reduction is associated with the conscious experience. It doesn't say it produces it.
It produces the type.
It can be taken to mean it makes it. It allows it to happen.
Well, it takes the raw components of consciousness, the qualia that are present in the universe as irreducible components, and organizes them or orchestrates them into the full, rich conscious experience.
So it channels them into.
Pardon me?
It channels them into a
channels
personal,
them, or we prefer orchestrates them,
experience.
and I think the musical analogy is most apt. So it takes raw sounds and tones, if you want to use music, and orchestrates it into a symphony or music or blues or however you happen to be feeling. And so it's kind of taking what's present in the universe and organizing in such a way to give full, rich conscious experience. So it's consistent with the idea that consciousness is present in the universe. And it's also consistent with the fact that the brain is damn important. We can't just throw away the brain. Because as of now, at least, it's the only known reservoir of consciousness. Whether you want to say it's a receiver or it produces it, I think it's a little bit of both. But, to just forget about materialism or forget about reality and forget about space-time and forget about the brain and just talk about pure consciousness, well, then, why bother?
It sounds to me then, the way you're talking about it, since those qualia are already there in the universe, and RD make them possible, brings you closer to what Henry's saying, is that mind or consciousness is, everything is happening in the mind. The mind is fundamental.
Well, with all due respect, I don't think that's
because
true.
the qualia is already there. That's mind. And that's what Henry's saying in his theory, if I'm understanding you correctly, Henry. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
so sounds
let me respond to
you're
that.
much closer to each other than appeared at
It's the underlying reality.
Yeah.
And,
Well, let me respond, because as I've told Henry and we've talked about, I think we agree that consciousness is associated with collapse of the wave function in the brain. Yeah. And his view, and I think Don's view, is that, and Wigner and von Neumann would say that consciousness is extrinsic in a dualistic sense that causes the collapse. Whereas we say, no, it occurs due to a self-organization of fundamental space-time geometry and an instability that causes the collapse. So the collapse occurs, and that orchestrates, if it's done properly, orchestrates all the primitive qualia into full, rich conscious experience. Right. So we don't need an outside agent to cause collapse. Agency and consciousness comes from the collapse.
So I'll clarify. I'm definitely not a dualist. I start with consciousness being fundamental, and where I differ with Stuart is that I assert that neurons do not exist at all when they're not perceived, nor do microtubules, nor does space and time, nor does any physical object. They do not exist apart from perception because they are the forms of our perceptions. They're part of our interface. So the reason I would say microtubules could not possibly be the source of consciousness is because they do not exist apart from perception. So they're a form, they're a style of perception, a particular format that we use. So it's a very monist point of view. Consciousness alone exists. So it's a monism. Space and time do not exist at all apart from consciousness, and only certain conscious agents use space and time as a
So
format.
you make consciousness fundamental.
Absolutely fundamental.
Yeah.
So I want to make it as clear as possible, the distinction between my view and the orchestrated objective.
So I would say the raw components of consciousness are fundamental, but we need the brain and the microtubules to put it together into the kind of experience we have.
So that's the difference. I don't.
I also would say I don't see how your view is at all testable or scientific.
Oh, it's absolutely falsifiable.
Well, how are you going to prove that nothing exists?
Absolutely. Well, we've already been doing that. I mean, that was the debate, and
He's
Henry
not
knows it
saying
better.
that nothing exists. He's just saying that it's not what we think it is.
Right.
He's
so
not saying that
going back to what Einstein said, if nobody's looking at the moon, does it go away?
Right. So Pauli said that you're asking, and when that was brought up, Wolfgang Pauli said that's the same as asking how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. But John Bell showed us that that's not the case. He showed that we can actually ask the question intelligently, does an electron have a definite value of spin when it's not observed? And every experiment done so far, and it's been repeated dozens of times because we can't believe the result, every experiment is consistent with what I'm saying. An electron does not have a position, a momentum, or a spin when it's not observed.
When it's not measured, when it doesn't collapse.
when it's not observed.
When it's not observed.
But that's the same thing.
Between observations, it has no position, and that means it's not there. If you don't have a position, you're not there.
So,
it could mean
so
it's
that,
in
but that's
superposition
a
of multiple.
particular interpretation of quantum theory, as the way I understand, because there are many
Right.
interpretations.
That's why it's careful to say every
Yeah.
experiment is compatible
There are
with
many
what I'm saying.
interpretation, and that's the interpretation
That's right.
you
Exactly.
So the question of the session was how close is science to understanding consciousness?
Yeah.
And I have to say that even though it seems hopeless given when you're listening to us, I think that
Speak for
this
yourself.
it just seems hopeless sometimes. You're right. It seems hopeless a little bit to me listening to us because we all have these different opinions and we're pretty strong about them. But I think that this is exactly why science is close to understanding both individual consciousness and universal consciousness or non-consciousness, whatever you want to call it, because we have all these different approaches and each of them has to have an element of the truth. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be representing them.
I would say we're very close. All we have to do is to get an experiment that shows that your theory is wrong.
Be my guest, please. I encourage everybody to try to do that.
I wonder, at the beginning of this conference, when I was thinking about it, and thinking from a perspective of spiritual tradition, the non-dual spiritual tradition, they believe that science is moving toward recognizing non-dual consciousness. Here we're talking about that's not necessarily what's going to happen. What makes me wonder, because there are different theories of consciousness, different ways of understanding consciousness, is whether the different theories of scientific theories of consciousness are going to reveal things about consciousness that non-dual spiritual people don't know about consciousness. There might be properties of consciousness not known by spiritual tradition that science can reveal. It's not necessarily going to reveal the spiritual part, but might reveal other things about consciousness that might be also very useful and interesting, and the different theories might reveal different things about consciousness. So why do we have to think about consciousness as a monolithic truth, only one way of it can be? It might be many ways. It can be many ways. But for somehow the human mind, the way I see it, always wants to make everything one. You notice? We want to unify general relativity with the quantum theory. Why not just leave them apart? Everybody does, each one of them does fine by itself, except in black holes, of course. But for some reason, human beings want to bring everything together, the same thing as wanting the material and the spiritual together. And all the spiritual, and here in NonDuality, we want to bring all the spiritual tradition together. And I was thinking, why not have differences too? Why can't reality be so rich it can appear differently to different people through different ways of investigation? You see, Stuart doesn't like that.
No, in 2000, Nature had an article, and they interviewed the 10 top physicists in the world on a theory of everything and what would it look like and what would it contain. And among those 10, only Roger Penrose said we need to incorporate consciousness into a theory of everything. And that's the only hope for a theory of everything. Yeah. And in fact, consciousness, in his view, links quantum mechanics and general relativity. Yeah. So right there is a big problem that's solved by having consciousness make that connection. So I think we need consciousness to explain a theory of everything.
Oh, I agree with you that consciousness is going to be very important. But I'm saying consciousness might have many properties, not just one property.
Well,
and maybe one property of the consciousness will do what you're saying. But other theories might reveal different things about consciousness. So I thank you all. I think it's been an exciting discussion, and I got to know the different ways. And I hope everybody appreciates it.